Hello, this is Dennis Nickbo speaking. As you can hear, my voice still isn't great, but I hope we'll get through this. This is the video that replaces the lecture that couldn't happen. I'll make it a bit faster because I know that you can of course stop the video, pause the video in order to look at the content of the slides as and when you have to. So this is the introductory session to the Psychology of Nations, and it's an introduction to the module, but also, if you like, a justification for why we're looking at this, why nations still matter. So the intended learning outcomes for today are to start thinking psychologically about national and cultural identities, and outlining a little bit what we're going to look at, how we're going to look at it, and how researchers have looked at it, what the sorts of disciplinary and methodological traditions are that we're going to draw on in this course. And what I really hope you're going to get out of this is a new perspective on things that you see on the news, things that you read in the newspapers that might be related to national and cultural identities. There's loads of that kind of material, and one of the great things about social psychology is that it changes your perspective on these things. It gives you a different way of thinking about those things that you see covered in current affairs. So, thinking psychologically about national and cultural identities, what does that involve? The first thing I'd like you to do is to take a piece of paper and write down 20 statements about who you are. Doesn't matter what you write, just start each sentence with the words I am, and then write down 20 statements about who you are. So please pause the video, do this now, and resume the video when you've written your 20 statements. So in your 20 statements, you will probably have found that you have some information there that is unique to you, that is about who you are as an individual, and you will have put probably some group memberships, some groups or social categories that you belong to, including gender, that you're a student, possibly your nationality or religious groups, supporter of particular sports teams, and so on. So typically what people do when they respond to this task is to have some individuating information and some group memberships. And that shows that our identity, our sense of who we are, is made up of those two components. Thinking particularly about the group memberships now, you might be able to think about whether some of them are more important to you than others. You might be able to rank them in that kind of way, for example. And you might find that you can put them in different categories according to their meaning. And what I'd like you to think about is whether some of them have more richness of content in terms of things that symbolize them, images that you associate with them, values attached to them, and perhaps traits of character that you associate with them than others do. So pause the video now, please, and think about whether you can categorize them in that way. So what this shows is that our sense of who we are, and you will be familiar with this as a social identity argument, of course, is made up of individual identity, personal identity, and social identity, where social identity is the part of our self-image that is informed by the groups that we belong to. And secondly, by doing this second exercise that you've just done, you've seen that in addition to the identification that you have with particular groups, there is also an aspect of identity content. Some content dimensions of identity that consist of things such as symbols, values, and traits that are characteristics of the group and that you inherit because you're born into the group or you join an existing group. You're not making it up as you go along. So this of course links to social identity theory, and when we talk here about social identity, we're really talking a little bit more widely about the work of Henry Tajfel. So as a revision, think about what social identity theory is about as formulated in the Tajfel and Turner 79 paper. Pause the video and think for a few minutes about what you remember about social identity theory. So the key point of social identity theory is that social identity is the part of an individual's self-concept deriving from their knowledge of membership of social groups, together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. So that's the identification with the group that's really at the core of social identity. In more detail, you may also remember that social identity involves a process of categorization, where you define yourself as a member of particular groups, identification with that group, where you develop an attachment to the group that involves you adhering to the group norms and trying to think about what you could do in order to be a good group member, and social comparison, where you compare your group with other groups at an intergroup level as opposed to an inter-individual level. But for the purposes of this module, when we talk about social identity, we're really talking more generally about Tajfel's work. Now, social identity theory was formulated first in 1979, or arguably a few years before that, but what's really of interest to us in this module is that Tajfel was really interested for quite a long time before that, particularly in national groups and the loyalty and attitudes that people held towards them. So there are some references there for you to read up on, which are quite interesting. What I'd really encourage you to do is not just to think about social identity in terms of the 79 paper, but the whole wider social identity tradition of which those papers are a part. And more recent writers in social psychology have rediscovered that part of Tajfel's work and tried to conceptualize national identity as a social identity, with some specifics that these authors, Boschi, Cinderella and Salazar, write about. Something else that will keep recurring throughout the module is Michael Billig's work on banal nationalism. So this is coming from a completely different tradition. Billig was involved in the minimal group experiments that you know as the first empirical evidence for social identity. So he has his roots there, but later on he became very much a critical qualitative psychologist and completely changed the sorts of things that he was doing. And one outcome of that body of work is his book about banal nationalism, which looks at those contents of national identity that I've already mentioned a minute ago, which in his account serve to reproduce and to remind people of national identity, not just of the particular national identity that they belong to, but also the idea that the world is subdivided into nations in a meaningful way, and that everybody has a nationality and so on. So you can read the quote from Billig there, and what's important about this is that this is banal because it's not always conscious. You might walk past a flag displayed outside some sort of public building and you'll find this perfectly normal. You probably won't even notice it. But it's there to remind you not only of your particular national group membership, but also of the idea that there are nations and that they are important things. If you like, pause the video now to think of some examples of banal nationalism that you might have noticed or perhaps not noticed, as the theory suggests. When we talk about nations, it might be productive to distinguish them meaningfully from some related concepts. The American sociologist Walker Connor has written about this, and he argues that what makes a nation is that a nation is a group with a shared sense of identity about which there is some kind of agreement, the perception that there is some kind of homogeneity, that people who belong to the national group are similar to each other in some meaningful way, and that there is the idea of some territory going along with that group membership. Now that can be an existing nation state, or it can be a nation state that is aspired for the national group. So if you think about a national independence movement, for example, there is a national group there which is clearly a national group, but it doesn't have its own nation state yet. It's aspiring to that, it's working towards it, but the idea of territory is always there. So if you read up a little bit on the Kurdish population, for example, in Turkey and Iraq, there is a clear idea of nationhood there, even though there's no existing nation state. And perhaps closer to home in Europe, you can think about what's going on in Catalonia at the moment. Now, in contradistinction to the nation, we have ethnic groups, which are groups with a subjective sense of togetherness, of common descent, of similarity, but without that idea of defending an existing nation state or working towards a new one. And the nation state then is a territorial and political unit where the population of that unit is at least roughly the same as a nation. That the nation is in control of its own territorial and political institutions. So think a little bit about how those definitions fit in with the social identity idea of a group that we've just talked about, and think about what might be the role of territory, what might be the role of institutions, and how social psychology can contribute to studying these kinds of groups. And you will probably notice that there are some links that you're already aware of with social identity and banal nationalism that we've just talked about there. So what are we going to do in this module? The first question is, do these cultural groups, such as nations, do they still matter? And to be honest, for some of my academic career, I had the impression that they would stop mattering, that we would all become so much more diverse, so much more integrated, that things like nationality would become irrelevant. And over the past few years, as you've experienced as much as I have, I'm sure, the opposite has happened. So these images are probably quite familiar to you and remind us about how strong the influence of national identities and cultural identities more generally is today. So what you can do, what I was hoping to do in the session that was then cancelled, would be to look at the newspapers of today and just pick out some of the stories that you think might be related two national identities in some way. And that's the first part, as I said, of looking at this kind of news content in a new way. Humorous aside here, there's somebody who's gone to the trouble of correlating or predicting the proportion of people in any given constituency that voted leave in the referendum to leave the EU from Premier League points in the season of 16-17. And you've just learned about regression in 2-res. You can see that actually it's quite substantial. A reminder maybe that not everything that's correlated is causally related. Now, we're going to talk, of course, about some of the social psychological research that is about these kinds of groups and these kinds of cultural identities. And just two examples to give you here of to give you a flavor of the sort of thing that we're going to do are these studies here. So Asghari and colleagues did a study in the Netherlands, and they used some qualitative and some quantitative methods to look at how people of Moroccan descent in the Netherlands saw themselves. And they did the 20 statements test that you've just done, and just over half of the statements that people wrote down were found to be in the collective category, nominating some kind of group membership as opposed to individuating information. And in addition to that, they did some interviews to talk about what's special about those group memberships and what are the challenges involved for people growing up in that kind of multicultural environment. So and one of the findings there is that people compare themselves not only to the other ethnic groups in the context in which they are, in this case the Netherlands, but also to others who might share their nationality, their ancestry, but remain in the country of origin, in this case Morocco. And also, of course, there is research about cooperation and working together in work groups, in multicultural work groups. And this study here, conducted in Belgium, shows a little bit about how work groups that are low in diversity, where members are more similar to each other, if you like, show some convergence in work-related values over time, which you can see in the top half of the graph, whereas the same thing doesn't happen with more diverse groups. Now, whether there is value convergence or not is in itself, of course, neither a positive nor a negative thing, but the finding is that this happens in low diversity groups, but not in high diversity groups. And throughout the module, we're going to look at these kinds of research findings and try to untangle what that means for the world that we live in today, for current affairs and for our own lives. So the module, as you know from the module outline, is going to be focused around these learning outcomes. So it's going to be both psychological and interdisciplinary. It's going to have an applied focus as well as theory and research evidence in it. And, of course, critical reasoning, an understanding of the diversity of theoretical approaches, research findings, and possible applications. That's something that needs to be appreciated as you get towards the end of the course. So that's what you need to learn. The grading criteria are the same that you're familiar with, so there are no hidden hoops to jump through there. And the module timetable, you know the detail from the module outline, of course, but broadly speaking, we're going to have a small section about nationalism and patriotism. Then we're going to spend some sessions looking at the content of identity, and towards the end we're going to talk about intergroup relations. The module is going to be assessed by 2 components, both weighted equally, and both assessed according to the same criteria. The first is going to be a video presentation. The second is going to be an essay. So in the video presentation you can do, well, pretty much what I'm doing at the moment. You can, for example, create some slides and do a voiceover, or you can record yourself speaking, or you can do some kind of animation if you have a talent for that sort of thing. The only stipulation really is that it needs to be an academic piece of work with some audio and some visual content, and it needs to be about your own national group or another group with which you're very familiar, and about the content of that group identity. So this is something that we're going to cover quite early on in the module, and the deadline for that piece of work is 8th of March. Now the second assignment builds on the first. So having talked about identity content in the first assignment, the second assignment is going to talk about some of the current issues facing the group that you've decided to talk about, and gives a social psychological analysis of those issues and possible ways to overcome them. And that's going to be done in written form, so that's very much a fairly traditional essay with which of course you're already familiar. And since we're a small group and since we have lots of time set aside to talk about these things, whenever you want to ask something about the learning outcomes or the assessment, please do, and I'll be happy to answer. I've mapped out in the module outline the topics that I've prepared and that I think are important for you to know about when studying the psychology of nations. But there's a little bit of flexibility built in. So if there's something that you would like to talk about in this module, something that you would like to discuss, maybe it's a particular paper, maybe it's a topic that isn't currently covered in the curriculum, please let me know and I'll see what can be done to accommodate it. It may not be possible, but we might as well try. So in terms of how the psychology of nations is studied and the sorts of things that we're going to look at throughout the module, we can first of all make a distinction between different levels of analysis that those kinds of studies may take. And this is something that perhaps hasn't been immediately obvious in the work that you've done on psychology or social psychology so far. So we can talk about social identity at a system level, at a group level, and at an individual level. So the system level would involve the contents and representations that exist, that you're born into, as it were, or that already exist when you join the group, by whatever way you join the group. So if you think about national groups, there is going to be some cultural heritage, some things such as flags, national anthems, and all of those things about which you have no influence at all, that already exist at the system level, and that you then simply engage with as a group member. Then, of course, there is a group level, where you can have a greater or lesser degree of identification with the current members of your national group, all the subgroups contained in that, such as particular political movements, families, and so on. And then at an individual level, of course, people differ individually in how they relate to their national identities. They might have a greater or lesser idea of a greater or lesser degree of identification with the nation, maybe more or less patriotic, and may accept or reject particular kinds of identity content, such as values or traits to a greater or lesser degree. In addition to that, there seems to be a fourth level of analysis, and that's the level of context. One thing that we're going to talk about quite a lot when we're going to talk about traits associated with national identity is that some of those trait ascriptions seem to be context dependent. They seem to differ according to the comparison context in which those judgments are made. So if you bear in mind these levels of analysis and try to understand for each study that you read where exactly things are happening, I think that will help you understand the contents of the course. One tradition that we're going to draw upon in this module is cross-cultural psychology. It's not going to be the main perspective. The main perspective is going to be a social identity perspective on national identity. But we're going to look at some findings from cross-cultural psychology simply because they illustrate how different cultural groups might differ in how they look at things, and vice versa, whether there are going to be similarities and universals that seem to be shared across national groups. Now, cross-cultural psychology typically involves fairly large studies. You're going to see papers with dozens and dozens of authors because data have been collected cross-culturally in lots of different settings. And these are almost always quantitative in nature, using fairly complex statistics to try to establish that the things that are being measured mean the same thing across cultures, and then of course trying to draw conclusions about central tendency in those cultures. And a book that I recommend is Peter Smith and colleagues' Understanding Social Psychology Across Cultures. We have 2 editions in the library. They're quite different, but they're both really good, so they will give you a good impression of cross-cultural social psychology. As a little example, try this exercise. So this is what's called the framed line test. On the left there you can see a big square with a line drawn through part of it. Now, the exercise that I'd like you to do is to sit down and draw smaller squares, the proportions being the ones that you can see on the screen. And in one of the smaller squares, I'd like you to insert a line in the same place as in the example square that has the same absolute length as the original line. And then in the second smaller square, please draw a line that has the same relative length as the original line, relative to the square in which the line is drawn. And when you've done that, take a ruler or tape measure and check which of the 2 tasks you did better at. Now, the finding from cross-cultural psychology is that Western populations usually do better at the absolute task, and Asian populations tend to do better at the relative task. Another surprising cross-cultural result that maybe you wouldn't expect concerns the Müller-Lyer illusion. You're probably familiar with this optical illusion. It's the idea that if I ask you which of the two vertical lines in this slide is longer, you will probably be tempted to say the one on the left, even though, and I'm sure you're familiar with this illusion, they're actually both the same. The thing about this is that it doesn't seem to be cross-culturally valid. So, whereas Western populations seem to tend to regard the left line as longer than the right, this isn't the case everywhere. And one argument that's being made about that is that perhaps the optical illusion is based on some degree of familiarity with artificially built environments that have lots of right angles in them. And only because they have right angles do we perceive an image such as the one on the far left as a junction of two walls that is receding away from us, and therefore we have the optical illusion of one being shorter than the other, because our mind adjusts for what we think is a corner, even though of course we're in a two-dimensional space. A second tradition of research that we're going to consider is cultural psychology. This is not the same as cross-cultural psychology. So cultural psychology is much more about how humans, how people relate to the meanings, the symbols, the values, and the identifications that are offered by their culture. And what this means is that there's a lot more very localized, smaller scale work about how people and culture interact. As a consequence of that, the studies in this tradition tend to be smaller, and they often involve qualitative or mixed methods in a way that cross-cultural studies don't. So some big names in cultural psychology are on the slide there: Heine, Walsener and Schwieder, and you can read up on their work if you're interested in cultural psychology. As an example of this, have a look at the video, which should be linked on the slide. So if you click on the piano, a YouTube video should open, and I would recommend you watch this video now and restart this video afterwards. So in the YouTube video that you've just watched, you had some glimpse into the idea of training children and doing children a favor by training them for future tasks. That seems to be more meaningful to Chinese Americans than it is to Caucasian or European Americans. And that's where the whole culture clash that you could see in the video is coming from. That Caucasian Americans seem to be getting the impression that this is borderline cruel parenting that the Chinese American families are doing there, whereas for them it's completely normal and a good thing to do. And what this illustrates, of course, is that if we take Western measures to do with parenting styles and apply them blindly to all sorts of cultural groups, we may be making quite big validity errors. And that's a specific case of a more general phenomenon to which we have to be quite attuned in this course, of doing what's called weird science. Weird stands for Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And that just happens to be a set of adjectives that describes the sorts of populations from which most of our research findings in social psychology come. And we must be very careful about generalizing from those kinds of samples, those kinds of populations from which we have sampled, to everybody in the world, where of course the majority isn't Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. Later on in the module we're going to talk quite a lot about acculturation psychology. So this is a tradition of research that's interested in what happens when two or more cultural groups come into contact with each other. That can happen, for example, in an immigration context where there's a native, a settled population, and an immigrant population. And this tradition of research is all about what happens in this contact situation at the level of individual adaptation to that acculturative setting, and the sociocultural level. How do those groups themselves change as a consequence of intercultural contact? So you can see that idea there again of net levels of analysis. So the group itself is changing. That's a system level or perhaps a group level of analysis. And then there is individual adaptation to the intercultural encounter. The most commonly used framework for studying acculturation psychology is that created by John Berry, a Canadian professor who's very influential in the field. And Berry argues that we can differentiate between different acculturation orientations by assessing people's attitudes towards two things. One of them is the desire to maintain heritage culture. So if you're an immigrant, to what extent do you want to keep some of the traditions, some of the ways of life, some of the symbols of the country from which you migrated? And the second question is, to what extent do you desire contact with other cultural groups? Do you want to keep separate, or do you want to join in and engage in intergroup contact? And according to these two measurements, Berry argues we can differentiate between four broad orientations towards acculturation. So if you desire both culture maintenance and intergroup contact, your acculturation orientation would be one of integration. That's the strategy that seems to be associated with the most positive outcomes in most settings. If you want to maintain culture but have less interest in engaging in intergroup contact, you would follow a strategy of separation. If it's the other way around, you would have a strategy of assimilation. And if you have neither a great deal of interest in culture maintenance nor in intergroup contact, you would be called marginalized. You would have a marginalization orientation. Now, of course, these are individual attitudes, individual strategies. What is always at play as well are the expectations of the wider community. So in an immigration context, for example, there is a question about what the host society makes possible. If, for instance, there is an immigrant group, some of whose cultural practices are illegal or undesirable under the laws and customs of the host society, then the immigrant group will be constrained in the sorts of strategies that it can adopt. It won't have all of them available to it. And there's quite a lot of literature now that looks at that idea of fit or concordance in acculturation orientations between groups and the sorts of outcomes that causes. We're going to look at all of that in more detail later on. For the moment, here's one theoretical point which is the interactive acculturation model created by Richard Boris, also from Canada, and his colleagues. And the argument here is that there are actually only a few combinations of strategies from the host and immigrant community that are consensual, in other ways that can work together and lead to good intergroup outcomes, good intergroup relations. As you can see, a lot of other combinations are either problematic, where there are substantial hurdles that need to be taken, or will almost inevitably lead to intergroup conflict. So if there is one of the two parties that desires separation or segregation, then intergroup relations can't be terribly good, because intergroup contact is avoided. So to take a research example, this is a study by Geneviève Barrette and colleagues. This is in Paris, and the comparison here was between the acculturation orientations and intergroup attitudes of French and North African students. The first important thing to say about this is that both groups favored an integration orientation, so high desire for culture maintenance, high desire for intergroup contact, or a strategy of individualism. Now this is something that Boris added in his interactive acculturation model in comparison with Berry's framework. And individualism is taken to be a strategy where the person neither has much interest in culture maintenance nor in intergroup contact, but this isn't marginalization because it's a voluntary choice. It's a choice of individualism where the person is essentially saying, these cultural identities just aren't that important to me. Personal identity is more important to me, and I'm happy with neither engaging in much intercultural contact nor maintaining my heritage culture, because it just doesn't matter to me that much. So integration and individualism were favorite strategies followed by both French and North African students here. And then if you look at the outcomes for different groups of students, you can see here that among the French students, those who endorsed integration or individualism, the consensual attitude, the one that was shared by the North African students as well, these people displayed less in-group bias, more contact between ethnic groups, less ethnocentrism, and less authoritarianism. And in the North African sample that was partly reflected, so ethnocentrism and authoritarianism were not significantly different between those who had consensual attitudes and the others, but for in-group bias, those who held consensual attitudes displayed less in-group bias, and those who displayed consensual attitudes had more intergroup contact. So those acculturation orientations and the fit between those that you hold and that the rest of society holds seems to make a difference to quite important variables in intergroup relations, including bias, contact, ethnocentrism, and so on. And that takes us to a very large body of theory and research in social psychology that we're going to make very extensive use of in the module, and that's the whole literature about intergroup relations. So we've already started talking about social identity, which is going to be hugely important throughout the whole course. We've started talking about intergroup attitudes such as bias. We're going to talk about prejudice and ethnocentrism. But there's also literature about intergroup conflict and intergroup reconciliation that we're going to get into in the second half of the module, where we're going to talk about intergroup relations and peace between nations. There are some books here that I recommend you have a look at if you have the time. So you may already be familiar with intergroup contact theory. I think we talked about it in social and developmental psychology a little bit. So Gordon Allport created the theory. So initially this was called the contact hypothesis, and it's developed into a whole big tradition of research called intergroup contact theory. And the idea here is that intergroup relations can be improved if groups come into contact with each other, ideally under particular conditions that make peaceful cooperation between them easy and productive. Now, you know the evidence, I think. So this is a very successful strategy. It seems to work under a wide variety of circumstances, including circumstances where not all of those conditions are actually met. But there are nevertheless caveats to it, drawbacks to it, including the finding that negative contact seems to have more of an impact on intergroup attitudes than positive contact. So a negative contact experience can undo a lot of positive effects from a good intergroup encounter. And more recently, researchers started to focus on indirect contact effects. So this could be extended contact that you have to the outgroup via other members of your group. Let's say you have no personal contact with Syrian refugees, but you know somebody quite well who does. So that's an extended contact scenario. Or in fact, contact can be just imagined. Now, this is probably not as effective as actual intergroup contact, but it might be a strategy that could work where contact isn't possible for practical reasons. Syrian refugees are not a bad example. Or where the likelihood of a negative contact experience is so high that maybe the group members need to be prepared in a sort of more indirect and mental way to get into real intergroup contact with each other. Also part of the intergroup relations literature, of course, is the whole literature about stereotyping, of which there is an awful lot. So just as a little game, here are some findings from a couple of studies to do with European stereotypes. This is about the stereotypes that other European countries had of a variety of European countries here. And there seems to be an association with geography, which may be counterintuitive. So, what do you think the samples in this study had to say about emotionality? Looking across Europe, which European nations do you think were described as more emotional? So the finding here was that there was a north-south distinction, with South Europeans being rated more emotional on average than North Europeans. In terms of competence, ability to do things, what do you think was the distinction there? Which European nations were rated more competent? So here the divide was between West and East, with Western Europeans on average being rated more competent than Eastern Europeans. And finally, in terms of morality, which European nations were rated as more moral. Here the relationship was with the size of the country, so smaller countries were rated as more moral than larger countries. In addition to all of this content in psychology, we're going to consider some interdisciplinary perspectives, and it is very strongly encouraged that you do this in your coursework as well. So your main argument, just like the main message of this module, will come from psychology, or more specifically social psychology, but have a look at some interdisciplinary work to see how it can help your thinking about the psychology of nations. So some examples include these here. We're going to talk a little bit about nationalism when we have our session about nationalism and patriotism, and to be frank, other disciplines are much more advanced than psychology in how they make sense of nationalism and how they've defined it. So there's a huge body of literature from philosophy, sociology, history and so on that says a lot of things about nationalism that are very useful for us as psychologists as well. When we talk about multiculturalism and interculturalism later on in the module, again we have some interdisciplinary literature that can help us. You may be familiar, for example, with Kenan Malik, because he has a quite well-known blog on the internet as well. And here at Christchurch, somebody who has written a lot about intercultural communication is Adrian Holliday, who is in education. And of course migration has been written about interdisciplinarily, and we're going to consider some of those perspectives in addition to social psychology. Right, so to conclude this, first of all, again, I'm sorry that the session didn't happen and that my voice is so croaky for this video. I would have wanted it to be a much more lively experience. But welcome nevertheless to this module and to our consideration of the world of nations. We've talked about what the module is about. We've talked about the topics that we're going to talk about, the assignments that you're going to prepare, and the way in which we're going to do things. And I'm going to take some time at the beginning of the next session just to make sure that we're all singing from the same sheet about these things. Our perspective, and the perspective that I'd like you to take for your coursework as well, is a social psychological perspective, but one that also considers interdisciplinary contributions and engages with them in some way. And again, I've said this before, please tell me directly and as soon as possible about something that you might want to discuss in class, or something that you think we could do better. We're a small group, we should all be comfortable with each other, I hope, and it is very much the case that the module can only be successful if we all work on it. So next time, when we're going to talk about nationalism and patriotism, the session is going to involve discussion of a couple of papers which I'd like you to prepare. So please read either of these papers that you can see on the screen there. They're both reasonably easy to read, I think. You don't need to understand all the detail of the analysis, but have a look at what you can get out of it, and we'll fill in the gaps when we meet in class. So I hope this was clear and suitable as a replacement for the session that I had to cancel, and I look forward to seeing you in the classroom. Bye.